Good time of day, and welcome to this episode 362 of Kodsnack. My name is Fredrik, and in this episode I talk to Nate Ebel about automation of all the things, well, maybe except tests, and also about book writing. Nate had just written and published a book on Kotlin development when we recorded this episode at Øredev in November of 2019. And we talk both about the contents of the book and Kotlin and making the right kind of interesting projects for a book, and also about the process of writing the book itself, which I found really interesting. Before we begin, I'd just like to make a quick podcast recommendation. Right before I sat down to record this, I listened to the very first episode of The Search Space, a new podcast you can find at thesearch.space, or check the show notes. And in the first episode, Felix, who hosts the podcast, talks to the poet of logic programming, Robert Kowalski, one of the co-creators of the whole field of logic programming and also of the language Prolog. It was a super interesting, really in-depth discussion. I certainly didn't catch everything, and nobody needs to feel that they have to. It's super interesting to listen to knowledgeable people discussing a topic they both know very well. So a big recommendation for the search space. Now, on to the show. Welcome to the podcast, Nate.
Thank you very much.
Who are you for the listeners? What do you do?
Sure. So my name is Nate Ebel. I'm an Android developer. I work at a small development shop of, I think, 13 people now.
Mm-hmm.
We work on creative apps for both iPhone and Android, as well as iPad and all that. And I work specifically on an app called Pigment, which is like a coloring book app, primarily for Android. That's kind of our differentiating factor is like really nice, realistic brushing.
Cool.
We have a lot of cool brushes and fill effects that kind of let you come in and pick some vector line art and get started making some really cool looking coloring images like very quickly. And then people that are kind of power users or extra creative do amazing things on that I wish I could emulate, and maybe one day will. But yeah, it's been fun. It's been very different than anything I've ever worked on before.
Yeah, I mean, it feels like drawing applications are their own little section of like interface and user interactions, and also, I guess, response times and stuff like that matters a whole lot.
Yeah, definitely. And that's an area of the code base that even after close to a year now that I've been on this team, I'm still just have barely scratched the surface of the drawing engine, because that's very different than the traditional day-to-day Android development or mobile development. Because you're getting down into lower level C++ and OpenGL code, and like you were saying, the performance really does matter a lot, especially across Android devices, which tend to be quite fragmented. Performance, power, and all of that. And so my colleague Ryan Harder saw a tweet yesterday from him where he's talking about improving the speed of one operation by something like 8 milliseconds or something like that, which sounds so trivial. In the Android world, if you're thinking about drawing at 60 frames per second, that's roughly 16 milliseconds per frame. Improving a single operation by almost half of that time
that's a lot.
is a huge win. So, that's something that, I'm kind of having fun watching a bit from now, but hopefully, we'll start to get into that code a little bit more, just because it's so different. And it's interesting to be able to see make an improvement like that and suddenly actually notice the difference in how you can interact with the canvas, how quickly the brushing appears, how smooth it is, and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and those things make such a big difference as well.
Yeah.
I mean, we've tried a few different platforms for drawing with pens and stuff. And those little extra milliseconds of delay or lack of delay make such a big difference.
Absolutely.
I mean, I guess it's kind of a bit maybe not similar, but related to game engine programming, in that that's very specialized. A lot of performance really matters, and this direct results. So your subject here at the conference for your session was automation, right?
Yes, my talk was titled "Automate All the Things," and it's a talk that I've given a few times this year, and each time it's been a little bit different, largely just because like automation is, I mean, that's a very broad term. Like you can automate literally all the things, which is sort of what that umbrella was, you know, a little bit play on the fact that you can just automate so much. Also hedging the bets a little bit because like, we're going to automate things, you know, I have more freedom to tailor the talk. But like in what I gave yesterday, when I gave the talk, was really focusing in on kind of a few different areas like the development pipeline for, you know, really any project. I mean, because I'm an Android developer, that was kind of where it was tailored, but most of the concepts and tools are fairly agnostic to that. So, you know, looking at, you know, actually just kind of getting a build set up and how to like start enforcing that build for people on your team, and then looking at building upon your automated build and your CI pipeline to start validating code. And how can you automate that both on your server, and how can you automate that locally? So we looked at things like, you know, just including a code style in your project and being able to share that effectively, to things like using Git hooks to validate that before you push code that might break your build, and then automating like the installation of that Git hook so that people don't have to manually copy a script, which is just like one extra thing to have to do on day one for a developer. So, you know, kind of this concept of trying to inspire people to think of how can you make this project more like a turnkey thing, so that, you know, a new developer on my team, or, you know, someone that's working on open source can just clone a repo and then immediately start being productive with that without having to talk to 5 different people and be like, oh yeah, this guy reminds me I need to download this, and this guy reminds me I need to add this key. So trying to think about small things like that, and then getting into, you know, like the code review side of things, and looking at small things like if you're working with GitHub, like adding pull request and issue templates to your project so that you can help kind of encourage people to give, you know, adequate detail when creating like a pull request. I believe quite strongly in code review, that, you know, code review should be like an enjoyable thing that people get benefit out of, but it can quickly devolve. Like if you start, you know, arguing over syntax or styling, or, you know, you don't know, like someone doesn't include enough detail in their pull request, and so they just say like, hey, review this code, and you have no idea what you're trying to review. Like, so there's all these ways that it can go wrong. And so looking at ways to help improve that to ensure it goes right. So like templates, I think, are one way. But then my favorite part of the talk is using the tool Danger to integrate with your build. And, you know, if anyone's not familiar with Danger, basically it's kind of like a scripting engine that you can sort of tie into your CI pipeline to basically add additional like information to your PR or run additional checks. And really, I think of it as just like automating away like all these things that you want to think about checking. So, you know, in an Android project, an example of that might be wanting to make sure that our application size stays small, because we want to just have smaller download size, because that's been proven to show increased like retention and everything. So, you know, keeping track of that size is something we want to do, but it's often, you know, you might not think about going and checking the size of that artifact every time. Well, so with Danger, we can actually like automate that to where every time our build completes, it checks the size of that and then adds a comment to the PR as if it was another person. So essentially you get like a bot account that starts adding these. So, you know, like that's just one example. Another simple one is just simply putting a message that thanking like the author of the PR for the code, which is sort of, you know, a nice little like friendly way to start off the PR on a good foot. And then other things like, you know, printing out the number of outdated dependencies in your project, or, you know, if you do submit a PR that doesn't have a description, you could add a little warning that says like, hey, please add a description to this. We've noticed that this is, you know, that there's not enough text here, or maybe the PR is really big, and you could put a warning like, hey, this PR is 50 files large. Maybe consider breaking this down. So like little things like that, to where you just don't have to spend as much brain power thinking through this like checklist of, all right, I need to look for this and this and this. And if, you know, if the PR is large, how do I kind of nudge the person towards smaller ones? You can kind of let the bot do that. So it saves you energy and having to think about how much effort to kind of put into that side of code review, because you want to save the energy for the actual review and the discussion. It also sort of has the benefit of, you know, if you do, let's say you have a bunch of linting issues in your code. And so with Danger, you can basically mark all of those linting issues as inline comments, as if someone went in and just pointed out and left comments on the lines. Yeah. So it makes it really easy to see where these like linting issues are in your code. But it also means that like because the bot is the one doing it, it's hard to like get mad at the bot. Whereas if your coworker just rolls into work one day and is maybe in a bad mood or hasn't had coffee, and they decide like they're going to mark 20 linting issues, and you see suddenly now you have 30 comments on a pull request, but 20 of them are like these, minor nitpicky things. That sets you off kind of, on this dark path where you might start to spiral, and pretty soon code review is not fun anymore. By kind of putting the bot in the middle there, it serves as like this buffer. And, we've been using a lot of these things in our project now for most of this past year. And like, I found it really nice. Like the APK size one, for example, like just the fact that it prints out the size of our artifact every time, that has definitely led to us catching regressions where maybe we had a big PR and forgot to optimize images before checking it in, and we noticed the PR jumped up.
So you have like a sudden change in size.
And it's not doing anything special. It's literally just printing out this one line, but like that just makes us aware of it. And like the pull request template actually want to distribute that. They still have to go grab that latest artifact, email it to people, send it via Slack, all these sort of distribution mechanisms that like really add up. In fact, I was just at the Android Developer Summit a couple of weeks ago and was talking with someone who they were in that very boat. He was telling me how painful it was because, on their recent release, they generated a build. He manually sent that to a few testers. They found issues. So then he fixed it, waited for the build, grabbed it, manually sent it out to people again. And pretty soon you're spending your entire day basically just like waiting for builds and then sending those off via email and all that. And so I was just trying to like kind of encourage people to think about how can we, streamline this. And so again, like if you can come in and day one, like clone a repo, scripts and stuff are automating all the setup, you make a change, you merge that into master, and suddenly like on day one, you can release to actual users or beta testers or whatever. But like that ease of like start for people, I think is really empowering. And I meant to look this up, but I believe there's studies out there that show like if you can actually like release within like your first couple of days of starting a new job, that like your 6-month retention rate or something like that ends up being considerably greater because like it just shows right off the bat that like the developers on your team are empowered to actually have an impact and produce, which I think is what most people want. Like if you come into a team and you are only ever working on bugs or something, or really hardly ever shipping code, like that quickly becomes demoralizing. And it took like 2 weeks to wait for the IT department to get your computer or stuff like that. Oh no, you're not getting access to the production server. Exactly. So like that was like, those are some of the types of automations I was thinking about. And this hadn't come up giving a talk earlier this year, but someone pointed out like, usually when you think of automation, like you think of like tests as being kind of like the first thing. And like I mentioned tests like multiple times in the talk, but always sort of like in passing. And I was kind of thinking about this in the last 24 hours, like, why don't I talk more about tests in the talk? And, one reason I think is just like, because it's the obvious one, I think people are just like more aware of it.
Yeah, it feels like more of a solved problem.
Yeah.
Sort of.
Yeah, in many ways. And so I think that was part of it. Because
makes sense.
I was more interested in like all the other ways that we could think about automating things. I also think part of it too is like, an Android world, which is what I know and am comfortable with. Like testing is like it's challenging. It's not as easy as it is in other platforms or domains like web development, for example. I've seen some testing frameworks there that are just so easy and like there's no debate. Like everyone is just testing. Whereas like in the Android community, it's often feels like you have sort of like one group. Oftentimes I think it's like the group that is going to conferences a lot and speaking or not. There's kind of like the vocal minority that's like, yes, testing, everybody's testing. But then there's also the other group that's very practical. It's like, but like testing on Android is like a pain in the butt. Like, unit testing maybe, okay, fine. But like integration testing, like on device end-to-end testing becomes really hard. And so I think part of it also is just like not wanting to just like go down that rabbit hole so much. Because there's so many talks about just that. And so kind of wanting to just get into other things, or you can start thinking about smaller wins before you tackle the big thing.
Yeah, of course.
The test suite.
Yeah. Do you know if there's a big difference between Android and iOS in that aspect, or are they like equally difficult to tackle? Because I feel like I follow the iOS side a little bit more, and I haven't really heard much about that type of testing there either.
I don't know for sure. My guess would be that it's maybe kind of in a similar boat, just because go low enough into both Android and iOS, and they're quite similar. They're doing very similar types of things, and I think the biggest thing is you're writing code sort of on one platform, presumably Mac, Windows, Linux, or whatever, but in the wild, it's actually running on actual different physical devices. And so I think that disconnect automatically makes it a bit harder to do that type of end-to-end testing. So I would imagine there's still sort of this concept of you have your unit tests, and those are probably easy enough to run, and they're fast and performant and all that. But as soon as you want to do that more end-to-end, what is this really like for the user? Now you're dealing with, the different hardware and deploying it to the hardware and the device differentiation, which even on iOS now, there's starting to be quite a bit of devices, so there's a lot to test there. You're dealing with the user inputs,
different screen layouts and size classes,
and because it's again phones versus a computer, you have all the gestures, and there's just so the surface to what you're testing is quite large, and so I think all of that just makes it more of a challenge, and I think those challenges are probably roughly the same on both.
Yeah, I mean they should be.
But yeah, I think so.
Yeah, but I think it's really interesting about all the other types of automation as well, because I feel like it's really interesting stuff to think about, and there are huge gains for automating all the small things. We have a strange step in our release process where I download an artifact from a bucket in GCP and put it on Google Drive, and then someone else eventually uploads it to GCP in another place. And why? Yeah, stuff like that. But I also feel like it's pretty easy to start automating in a place where it doesn't really scale up, where it's hard to take those extra steps to make it really turnkey. I mean, some things are easy for me to create a little script in a corner on my machine, and it runs for me, and then I forget to maintain it or something, and it doesn't, like you said with Git Hooks, it doesn't get automatically installed if I check out somewhere else, and then it sort of gets lost. Or I do something that's nicely automated in the editor I currently prefer, and stuff like that. It's a lot to think about in those aspects as well, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I love that Git Hooks example, and I didn't come up with that. That's something I found in a blog post. I was like, oh, this is brilliant. Started using it, in our project, and every time I've given the talk, that's always one of the few things that everyone's like, oh yeah, we're using hooks. Actually, a lot of people didn't even know about hooks, but then the people that did know hooks were like, oh yeah, but we always have to remind people when they start, oh yeah, just go copy this random script into this random directory. So I really like that idea of that extra step of making it transparent. If in the case of this specific example I gave, basically as soon as you sort of build your project for the first time, that Git hook gets copied over.
Oh, so it's part of the build script.
Yeah, you tie it into build scripts. You don't even have to manually tell it go run this script. It just gets copied. So as soon as you try and push for the first time, basically it's gonna check the formatting. And so just I like that piece of making it so integrated and transparent, I think is quite powerful. And applies to any type of thing you're automating. In fact, right before I flew here to Sweden for the conference, I was working on a script where kind of the content team at the company I work at, Pixite, is trying to automate or the content team, regularly will go through and kind of curate, basically coloring pages and books and stuff that we want to feature in the app. And then they, will basically create a page, run this script and upload it manually. And it's easy enough to do. It's kind of part of the job, but it also means it's just this one more thing. They have to go in and create the page, run the script, put it up there, make sure it works and all that. And so that's just another thing. We're well, what if we just sort of we create our own script? We can basically tie this into like our build system in a way to where just like every day it's just going to check like, hey, is there a script with like this timestamp? If so, automatically put it up. And so just like, again, it's just like letting, theoretically will let us like batch up these featured layouts essentially and, automatically process them when the time comes, which, is like not a huge win, but it is something where like now instead of having to say like, all right, once every couple of weeks I have to go do this, they can say like, I can sit down once and do these for the next month or something or several months. Yeah. And then it's just off the plate for that amount of time. So yeah, like there's so many different ways. Like I think one of the messages I sort of like end my talk with was kind of like similar to like the Marie Kondo method of like cleaning. Like basically like, if you're losing sort of like joy or time or energy to some part of like your development process, whether it's the code or documentation or distribution, like any part of like the overarching thing of like software development, there's opportunity to kind of automate that and streamline things. And it might not be streamlining it for you, the developer, but like if you can streamline the process of submitting issues for a project manager and like make that easier, like that's a win. Or getting it out to your testers, like that's a win. Like there's so many spaces there for wins. And I think somewhat selfishly, like tying it back to the beginning, it's like because developers want to just like write code most of the time. Like you rarely talk to a developer that's like, oh yeah, like I love submitting issues, like documenting repro steps, and emailing applications to test. You don't want to sit down and write code and build things. So carving out more ways to do that, I think is usually well received. Like every time I've given this talk, people are like, oh yeah, like this will save us time here. Oh yeah, this will be an awesome, lifesaver. And it's like, that's fun to tie into this notion of like, everybody just wants to write code. So here's some ways to help you do more of that.
Yeah, exactly. It's useful for everyone, no matter what code you're writing.
Exactly. Yeah.
So you talked about danger, right? Do you have any other like tool recommendations?
So I mean, danger is one of the more interesting ones because it is like platform agnostic. Like whatever project you're working on, danger should totally work. The Git Hooks is another one. I just like honestly, even up to the night before my talk, I updated kind of my sample project and the slides to work with GitHub Actions. Basically, so like added, integrated the build pipeline using GitHub Actions, which like I think that's a pretty cool tool that's available now, assuming you're using GitHub, which a lot of people are. But the reason I like it is because, one, it's tightly integrated with the code. So it makes things like, authenticating tools and stuff really easy because like the token's just readily available there for the authentication. But also just it makes it quite easy to do things like, tying into triggers. So, maybe you want, actually a good example is almost, I think of it as like a hello world version of GitHub Action because they put it right on kind of like the homepage of here, explore actions. But like, you could set up an action to sort of thank a user the first time they contribute to your project. So you can tie into the different triggers of like, I interacted with a pull request for the first time, or I interacted with creating an issue for the first time. And so there's always like these high level triggers for things you think about of like pull requests, issues, milestones, stuff like that. And then below each of those, there's things like, did you create a pull request? Did you comment on it? So you really get like a lot of control over all these areas of the pipeline. Or you can do like schedule things. So you can set up like cron scheduling for a workflow. And like, it makes it so easy to basically go in and define a workflow. And then, they manage all the minutia of actually running it on time, scheduling it on time. And I've seen some really interesting, like, workflows built on GitHub Actions. Like, the example I've done so far, we're using this at work. And then for the talk I gave, simple build pipeline. There's nothing too exciting there. But I've seen like examples of actions where like someone built, a workflow where every time they pushed a commit, like the candy dispenser, the candy dispenser on their desk would like spit out a piece of candy to them or something. And like,
that's a good one.
Like, that's just like stuff like that, I think, is really cool. And it's not like you couldn't do that with other pipelines. Like I've given this talk before using like Circle CI, you could do Bitrise, Bitbucket, there's all these ways, but like just making it really accessible, I think, is awesome because it can get people into, this idea of, continuous integration and setting up kind of their own like build server. And that's something that I find a lot of people I talk to, at least kind of again in the Android world, that maybe they're familiar with that, but haven't really done any of that themselves. So it kind of seems like this black box in many ways where like they just know that they merge in a pull request and an APK gets added to this server directory eventually. And so I like GitHub Actions for that reason, because people are familiar with GitHub and it makes it very easy for them to kind of see how these things connect, as opposed to having to jump between other tools and go look through logs elsewhere. So that integration, I think, is helpful, at least for people getting off the ground. It might not be right for everybody's builds, and there's still some rough edges, I think, around caching and parallelization and stuff that I'm sure will get better over time. But yeah, it's just like a way to get up and running with like automating your build system. I think it's great. So that's definitely one of like the tools I've kind of been excited about this recent round of getting the talk.
And then adding stuff to the build script to set up things locally as well.
Oh yeah,
that's really
that
nice
one's neat too. Like I said, adding them on scripts and then like tying the scripts into the Gradle build system for Android, but like whatever build system you want would work as well. Like I think that's a really neat one. In fact, I think there's some more of that we could do in our project I work on, where we have different like secret keys and different things that are like encrypted that have to go in and like run certain commands. And I imagine if we like wanted to, we could automate a lot of that as well. But I don't know, for us, we're such a small team that like there's only been like I was the second person added to the team, and like that's one new person in several years. So like there's some levels where you do have to ask like, is it worth automating this? Because if we don't add another person to the team for 2 years or something, then we're not getting a lot of benefit.
But maybe I have to get a new computer someday and set it up. So
exactly,
I mean, it might pay off all of a sudden as well.
And that's a good point, because a lot of times, especially like setting up a project for the first time, you forget how many little things you had to do until a computer goes out, or until you're onboarding an intern or a new hire, and suddenly like, wow, it's taken us 3 days to set up the the development environment to just be able to like build the project.
Yeah, exactly, because there's always like 2 or 3 steps that we totally forget about. It's like, oh no, step 0 and step -1.
Exactly.
And I mean, it's also tricky. I mean, it's easy enough to create some kind of setup script once, and then because you don't add another person for 2 years, suddenly that script has sort of aged and it doesn't really do the right thing anymore. That's a tricky side as well. If you automate something and sort of forget about how it was done to begin with.
And that is one reason I like the idea of storing a lot of that stuff as artifacts in the repo. Because it's just more visible than if you have like some local script. Same thing. One of the plugins we use for automating our releases to the Google Play Store, it's a plugin called the Gradle Play Publisher plugin, and basically lets us store all the app store listing information as artifacts in the repo. So if we want to update a screenshot, we can do it there. Update the app description or the title or the icon, it's all in the code. So you know where it lives. It's clear who owns that. You can see the changes over time in the Git history. And I feel like it makes it easier to kind of like manage all of that and maintain it, really. Because that's always sort of the big challenge with like any type of documentation or like metadata is, just keeping it up to date, and scripts to be the same way.
I realize now that we're talking about, we have a few Git hooks as well. And they probably broke on my machine a long time ago, because we don't have that automation in place. They're sort of covered up by other things. But still.
Now you'll have something you'll go back and...
Exactly. Immediate value. It's wonderful. And we'll, of course, link to your presentation and anything else we mentioned in the show notes for the episode as well. So everyone should go look it up and learn something too. Should we switch gears a bit?
Sure.
You mentioned when we were preparing for this that you had written a book.
Yeah, just I think it came out less than a month ago.
Wow.
I think the official publication date I think was October 11th.
Ooh.
And then I was, I couldn't bring myself to really officially announce it for a couple of weeks after that, because it was just sort of like this almost like hangover from the work of finishing it up. But so I wrote a book and published on the Kotlin development language,
cool.
Which for those that aren't familiar, Kotlin is a kind of a new statically typed programming language that primarily targets the JVM. So it has become extremely popular in the Android development space. In fact, it's now kind of the default language for Android development.
Oh, cool.
Google's official stance is sort of Kotlin first.
Wow.
They still support C++ and Java, but they're kind of all the new stuff is coming in Kotlin.
That's cool.
But then kind of the really neat thing about Kotlin is that it does target just about anything else you could want. So it can compile down to sort of both like kind of just standard vanilla JavaScript or like node flavored JavaScript. Ooh. And it also compiles down to native targets. So that makes it viable for like iOS or Mac or Windows or Linux or IoT. Yeah. And so it's, like I said, it's really popular in Android. It's getting more space like in, back end, because going from like Java to Kotlin is extremely easy. It interops well. But that it is like becoming more and more viable in all these other spaces as well. And so, like the book that I wrote sort of kind of splits into a couple of parts. Kind of the first section or first part being, trying to give like an overview, like where the language is coming from, some of the rationale behind it, like the motivations and all that stuff. And then kind of go into sort of a quick deep dive into just the syntax and the features of the language. And one of the things I think that differentiates the book a little bit is to get into interop, which, and kind of like the practical aspects of interop. So the things that are most likely to come up if you start using it, particularly in like an Android project. And then kind of the final big section is the one that I thought was really compelling. It's pretty much why I said yes to writing the book, was that we go into essentially 4 or 5, Hello World plus. So basically like Hello World projects, and then like maybe one more step past that, but on how to like actually start using Kotlin on all these different platforms. So like we walk through setting up an Android project with Kotlin, which is super easy to do. It's just like pretty much out of the box way. So in that one, we kind of jump right past that and then get into some of the cool new like libraries that Google's putting out to take advantage of it. And then we do an example of a project where we write some Kotlin that is then compiled down to JavaScript, and then we integrate that into like a simple, like just HTML script, but basically just to like demonstrate this process. Like you can write statically typed Kotlin code and run that like in your browser and, write your logic or whatever for a controller or something in there, which is pretty neat. And then do an example of, writing a simple kind of web service with a Kotlin based server framework called Ktor, which makes it really easy to write server code. And then kind of the last one, which is to me the most interesting part of it, is this concept of a Kotlin multi-platform project. In fact, I went to a couple of talks yesterday on Kotlin multi-platform from Kevin Galligan, who's all about Kotlin multi-platform these days. And anyways, the concept of a multi-platform Kotlin project is that you can basically write some shared logic in like this shared module, and then basically have, kind of platform specific versions of that and use it on all these different platforms. So you write as much as you can, just like in the shared module. Some pieces might have to be customized a bit depending on certain implementations of things per platform. But basically you write one set of shared code that you can then consume on multiple platforms. And like the kind of the immediate use case for this is the mobile world. So the idea is that basically you just end up having like your regular native like Android experience here, and then you build a framework from this shared code that you then consume in Xcode when building your iOS app. And it's a really interesting use case because it contrasts with other sort of cross-platform mobile frameworks like React Native or Flutter because it's not shared UI. It's just shared logic.
Yeah.
So within that, there's inherently, probably a little bit less risk in that because it's not an all or nothing approach. And on Android, it's no different than what you'd be doing. So really, it's like pure native there. And on the iOS side, it's just another framework.
Yeah.
But so like that's like walking through setting up that I think is a pretty cool sort of piece of the book as well.
Yeah, it's a really interesting part. It feels like a natural way of extending it as well. I mean, it's always a bit of a question mark when there's something that claims to like solve the whole thing and share it between all the different platforms, and it becomes some kind of least common denominator solution for each of them. And I still want to specify stuff, but this sounds more like, I build the right UI in the way that's most logical for that platform, and then I reuse all my logic. Yeah. It makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I agree. It makes sense to me. Like having tried, I haven't gone super in depth into some of those other ones like React Native or Flutter, but I have tried them, and like that's always kind of the issue I have with it is such an all or nothing approach, which like for a small one-off thing is totally fine.
Yeah, sure.
In my opinion. But when I think about like maintaining something for years, just adding those extra layers of abstraction and start to worry me a bit. But the idea of just having like this library of shared code and then binding to like native stuff, it seems to give you the best of both worlds. Because now like you can kind of evolve with the platform wherever needed.
Exactly.
But then you still can like make use of common constructs, models, common tests, which I think is a big one. And if for some reason like that sharing breaks down, then you can kind of gracefully revert back to native everywhere.
Yeah, of course.
Whereas, if you have an all or nothing approach and decide to fall back, like now you're rewriting everything on both platforms. Like
exactly.
It's a lot more work to sort of pull back going that direction.
Yeah. It's hard to imagine shared codes suddenly falling out of style. Yeah. Then you have a bigger problem, perhaps.
Exactly. Especially in a case like, with Kotlin multi-platform on Android and iOS. Like I said, it's on Android, it's just the code you would normally write anyway. So like there's nothing to fall back to. Like, I mean, unless the code is just wrong when you write it the first time, that's going to be there and be fine.
No framework can help you if that's the big problem.
Exactly. Yeah. You have other problems at that point. So like that's kind of like the overall concept of the book was to trying, it's not necessarily like the beginner, like entry level Kotlin book, but if you're familiar with, object-oriented program, it does get a little bit into like functional programming and reactive programming. But it tries to like get deep into like the important parts of the language quickly and then show you how to actually like start practically using that in some different domains, which I think is really interesting. I mean, I've been using the language for quite a while, so I'm definitely kind of a fanboy in that sense. So I encourage lots of people to check it out. But a lot of programming books, oftentimes they're like amazing reference guides, but sometimes like you want to go and then like know how to actually like use it. And so I like the idea of having a book that like, yes, it's reference, it highlights, not everything in terms of syntax and all that stuff, but it gets at like the key bits, but then immediately starts to show you like how and where to start using that.
It feels like that gets lost sometimes, but maybe the book starts with like one chapter that's really hands-on that way, and then it's all too much reference. And I mean, if I'm at the level where I need that proper reference, there's usually stuff out there I can find online.
Yeah, totally. And with the book, there is also the code examples. So, as you're going through the book, like there is sample code. And when you get to the point of like actually setting up the projects, like you have those projects there. So you could clone the repo and immediately start playing with this idea of a Kotlin multi-platform project or an Android project. So that was like, that's the book in a nutshell, but it taken most of the last year. So it was one of the larger undertakings, project-wise I've ever done. Yeah.
So how did you come to writing the book?
So I was contacted by the publisher, which was Pact Publishing, which they do a lot of technical books, every year. But like they had reached out a couple times on different similar but different pitches. And I had said no. And finally, they reached out with an idea that was a little bit more compelling to me, also at a time when I had a little bit less going on. And I'd always wanted to write a book. I always like to write, and since I got more into like my career, I've tried to blog and stuff, and I thought it would be interesting to sort of like push those skills and learn new ones and write something that big. And so I said yes with that, and really like in some ways it was like this big massive undertaking, but then also like in the day to day, like it wasn't that complex. It's like
that's good.
Starting off like create an outline and like break it down into like smaller tasks, not any different than you would with like a big feature you're getting ready to write. And then, in the day to day, it was just like trying to kind of fill in these tasks one by one. I think the big challenge was just, staying motivated and engaged over the course of like 11 months. Yeah. Especially, when other stuff's going on, still have a regular job and trying to, speak at conferences and like do all this other stuff. Like, having deadlines every 2 weeks for that 11 months.
Okay. So that's how it works.
Yeah. That's how it worked with our setup. And I think having those deadlines, like sometimes they were a pain and quite cumbersome, but they definitely helped me stay on track. Yeah. Which was a good thing.
Yeah, of course.
Which is definitely a good thing.
So were they like mainly set up by the publisher, or did you sort of discuss what the deadlines were going to be beforehand?
Yeah. So like, I mean, they kind of came out with a general timeline and we talked about it a bit, but I didn't really have too much in the way of like complaints or anything. And there was definitely flexibility. Like there was a couple times where I had like, a chapter draft was supposed to be due like the same week that I was speaking at a conference. And I was like, hey, this one's going to be a couple days late. Like, sorry that I just have multiple things to prepare this weekend. And that was always fine. It'd always be like, I might submit one a couple days late, but the next one would be right on track. Or I actually think I got in a schedule where like everything ended up being about 1 day past the due date, so it's like everything just like shifted like 1 day backwards. But I think the overall deadline, like we stayed on track with that, which was a good thing. But so now we're kind of like I'm in this phase, which again is just totally new, of like having to like try and like promote a book, which I wish like I didn't. The last several weeks for me of like finishing the book, and then I was at the Android Developer Summit, and now here like I wasn't quite on top of my game enough to like bring copies with me and stuff. And I wish I would have, because like this would have been such a perfect venue for that with so many software developers and everything. But like that's sort of like the next phase here, starting to get the word out and talk to people like this, and share what it's about, and that's something I'm quite excited about, because when I did sort of do my like kind of official like announcing of it on like Twitter and stuff, like, hey, I wrote this book. I was really pleasantly surprised with how much like support I got from the community. Everybody was quite excited. I had a lot of people asking like, how can I get a copy, or can I get ebook codes to like give it away in my meetup, and that was like totally unexpected to me. I was fairly certain that I would say like I wrote a book, I'd get a few people liked it or everything, but then like nobody would care or want to actually read it. But like it's been really amazing and flattering that like friends or other people in the community like order the book, or like oh, Nate's book just got here, I'm excited to read it, which has been very like surreal for me, because I very much was viewing this as like I'm going to write this book for myself, to test myself. I'm going to learn from it, but I didn't really expect people to want it. So it's been fun to see that at least some people have wanted it and have said some good things about it. So now I'm excited to, talk about it, promote it, and, hopefully more people get it and can, help introduce them to the language and start seeing, where and how they can use it. Like I think that was another big motivation for me is, for the people that are familiar with Kotlin, they pretty much just associate it with Android, because like that's where there's such a strong community for it right now. But it does work in a lot of other places. And like for me, I love the idea that, I can, theoretically have like this single code base where like I have all these shared models and stuff, and I'm using those models on the server side, and then I'm building the server side code in Kotlin. And then I have my mobile apps that are also both heavily leveraging Kotlin. And I've started playing with that, and it is like, it's quite powerful, especially, you know, like I haven't done a lot of, you know, like web or like server development. So like being able to use a language that I'm already comfortable in is just one less thing to have to pick up. And then thankfully there's, you know, another great thing about Kotlin is the tooling and everything is quite awesome. JetBrains is the company like really developing Kotlin and also developing, you know, the tooling for it. So that integration makes it really nice. So it's very enjoyable to work with, and, you know, just all that integration, everything, it makes it really fun. So definitely out there trying to promote the language, promote the book.
Are there any like unexpected rough spots when it comes to like multi-platform Kotlin?
Yeah, there definitely are. I would definitely encourage people to actually check out some of the Kotlin multi-platform talks from Øredev here, from Kevin Galligan, because that's pretty much exactly what he was talking about was some of those rough spots. It's definitely, you know, a quickly moving platform. Like it's early days right now, but it is like the pieces are starting to come together. So like one of the big pieces was, in the last year, the concept of coroutines came to Kotlin, you know, as sort of like the new way forward in terms of like handling concurrency with Kotlin. And that has worked fantastic on like the JVM targets, you know, regular, you know, Java, JVM, Android. But in the like native side of that, there weren't multi-threaded coroutines, which we presented challenges and was kind of a non-starter for some people. Well, like that finally, apparently there's a branch Kevin would mention in his talk that like within a couple of days ago, they finally have a PR, I think, ready to merge that in. So presumably like in the next version, like we're going to finally have that. And then like that is sort of like a stepping stone needed to start building some of these other libraries. And so you can start to see like, you know, some of the pieces are already there. Like there's already multi-platform libraries for like settings and working with SQL. And now that we're starting to have, you know, some of these other things coming online, hopefully like that community, that ecosystem will start to develop. Because, you know, with that stuff in place, the story I think is quite compelling. So it kind of comes down to, do you have a team that, you know, has the developer power or resources available to write sort of that multi-platform like share stuff if it doesn't already exist, or do you need to just kind of like wait a while till you have more tools at your disposal or at your disposal? But like once they're there, or if you just like don't need them, it works quite well right now. Like you can go in and, you know, integrate a small shared library that works on Android, you know, the server iOS fairly easily. And it will continue to get easier as like they stabilize a little bit and you start to get like consistent documentation. Like that's one of the challenges right now is like, if you want to go figure out how to do this, you'll find a bunch of like blog posts and stuff, but like every month roughly it's a little bit changing. So like a lot of the blog posts are out of date, but like as that slows down, it's gonna be easier to find them and it'll be easier to get set up.
Check the post dates.
Exactly. Trying to find like the most recent you can, because it definitely matters.
This has been super interesting. I think we're almost out of time. Is there anything else you would like to add right at the end?
I don't know. Nothing comes to mind.
We covered a lot of ground.
Yeah, we did. I think that seems like a decent place to stop. I'm sure we could keep talking
probably
for quite some time. But I don't know that I have anything to last words of wisdom in this last little bit. So
check out the book. Check out the talk.
Check out the talk. You know, people also, you know, like I said, check out the book. But also, I'm pretty easy to find online everywhere. I'm sure we'll link to that in the show notes. But basically, I have the same username all over the interwebs. So it's N, the number 8, and then EBEL. And you can find me, you know, Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, YouTube, like all of that stuff. So very easy to find. I guess I could plug that too. Like if you're interested in Android development, I have a YouTube channel that's pretty specific to Android. Also gets into a lot of Kotlin stuff as well. And I love to chat. I'd love to hear people's thoughts on like automation, like types of things they're doing in their workflows, whether it's, you know, mobile specific or just other cool things like automating scripts and stuff like that. I'm probably will give that talk again. And so always looking to like add cool little things to it and make it more valuable for the people listening in the future.
Yeah. So thank you so much, Nate.
Yeah, thank you. This is awesome.
Let me put it this way, Mr. Raymer. The 9000 series is the most reliable computer ever made. No 9000 computer has ever made a mistake or distorted information. We are all, by any practical definition of the words, foolproof and incapable of error.